that's right. So, thank you very much for your time. I do appreciate it. It's an interesting subject. I mean, I suppose systems and complexity, nothing changed, nothing new. What I'm hoping to do is stimulate some debate, some challenge, some curiosity around people's views. I've quite often liked to, I suppose, stimulate a bit of curiosity around some of the subjects, and for me, nothing changed, nothing new is just for me because I'm very much a love looking at yesteryear, looking at all the the models within systems thinking, the complexity, what it means for us, and also some of the recent events that we've witnessed. So there's an element of me thinking, well, actually, have things changed? Have things moved on? Are we doing the best we can, etc.? So that's a bit of the curiosity around this area here. So for me, very simply, looking at the past, looking at the present, looking at the future in terms of those three areas. I suppose that they will be the primary areas of where I'm starting to look at different stuff in terms of looking at yesteryear, the previous, where we are now, and then what does it look like in the future from a complexity perspective. And obviously, to start off with it, I'm sure everyone has seen this this slide here. I like showing this slide purely because it just shows the enormity of what complexity science looks like in terms of starting from even beyond 1940 to the 1900s, all the way through to 2010 and plus. And you can kind of understand why sometimes people get quite confused about what systems thinking is all about when you've got this mirage of color, circles, lines and squiggles. So it just, I suppose it gives you a full appreciation of what's actually going on there. But when we look at the past and some of the elements there, then you kind of appreciate, well, there's huge amounts of people out, from Stafford Beer to Peter Checkland, to Lewin, to Kurt Lewin, and so on. So there's a huge amount of people that there are actually here, from Jay Forrester from Systems Dynamics, and the likes of Nicholas Lukeman, Eric Trist, and so on. So there's a huge melee of people, I suppose, from the past who have been the forefathers of some of the systems thinking, and systems thinking being a meta discipline in that it's an umbrella term for lots and lots of other models, methods that you use within that. So it could be VSM, it could be systems dynamics, etc. So but when we look at a sort of some of the system concepts, now these aren't all of them, these are just a few of them, and it backtracks from the early days of starting off at the very end, at the very start, with systems and cultural theory, with the likes of Alexander Bogdanov, with some of the areas there around cultural theory. Looking at cybernetics is obviously widely, well, relatively known widely to some, but you get looking at Norbert Wiener, Forster, and the well-known Stafford Beer. So some of those things around the cybernetics, but it goes back to 1940s and sometimes earlier. And these dates are not set in stone. They're just dates to give you an appreciation. Complex theory, system dynamics, all the way through systems, soft systems methodology with Peter Checkland, and then over the right-hand side to some of the more traditional stuff that people use, such as Lean Six Sigma, SODA, Fifth Discipline with Peter Senge, and some of the critical systems stuff, which really, whether you're looking at the likes of Robert Flood or even recently Dr. Mike Jackson, so that it gives you a kind of, hopefully it gives you an appreciation of the enormity or how long some of the system thinking concepts have been around, and hopefully adds that layer of, wow, what I need to learn more of, I need to understand more, I need to understand how useful it is. But I think when I've been reflecting on some of these models and spent a huge amount of time looking at these, you kind of think, well, actually, how many of them have been lost in the past or have been lost through time, and how much of this, a lot of these concepts that you can see here, or some of these concepts are still ingrained in the way that we make sense of complexity, as we see things now. And as I go through this presentation, feel free, because I can't see everyone. So that's, I suppose, one of the disadvantages about virtual presentation. You can't see everyone. So please shout out, or if you've got any questions, or put something in the chat box. And I'm sure one of the gang will help to ask any questions if they see anything coming in the chat box as such. But I suppose one of the opening questions I'd like to ask, and please feel free to unmute yourself and just shout out, but I'll be interested to understand at the moment, if we look at systems thinking, what are you seeing? So what are people seeing today through systems thinking? And feel free, we'll just spend a couple of minutes just highlighting some things that you see around systems thinking. Anyone want to start off for 10?
What about Wardley mapping? Do we consider that systems thinking?
Yeah, I do believe so. Yeah, I think, yeah, absolutely. And it's a really interesting point. Was that Russ, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think Wardley mapping is really, really important. But I think there's lots of mapping. There's lots of systems mapping, process mapping, Wardley mapping. And Wardley mapping is interesting, actually. I had a conversation last week with a colleague of mine exactly about Wardley mapping, around trying to use Wardley mapping to, we started to look at how we can map the current pandemic using Wardley mapping, and we started to play around with that last week. So no, absolutely. But I think it's one of those hidden arts, Russ, where there's a lot of, I suppose, diagrammatic methods that are one of these things that are sort of in the past and very rarely practiced in modern day. I use them all the time. But has anyone else heard of Wardley mapping, or just, I'm sure there are others. Yeah. Ben, I would be disappointed if you hadn't.
I mean, the whole of Agile is based on systems thinking as well, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, absolutely. And again,
try posting that on LinkedIn and see what people say.
That would be
Agile, imagine that.
I didn't even advocate for it. I just posted a link, and there was a lot of response.
Was that about Agile, Ben? Was it? Yeah.
One of the signatures of the Agile Manifesto has a piece. Agile Scrum is based on complex adaptive systems, and not everybody agrees with that.
Well, you can always, LinkedIn is always a good test to see how much feedback you get, or I'm being polite, I suppose, in feedback, really. But it's always a good little test for certain things. But anyone else? Yeah, what else are people seeing in systems thinking?
I'd actually see. To give you an idea, I'd see a sort of fluffy blob that sort of sits across multiple academic disciplines, neither of which actually understand it. That would be my metaphor for.
Yeah, no, I agree. No, it's a really good point there. And I think, for me, again, some of the things that I'm seeing, okay, and again, this is just, I sometimes see elements of oversimplification, and obviously, this presentation to some degree has been put together to sort of prod, poke, and provoke people, just to try and stimulate people's thinking. But I think there's an element of oversimplification sometimes, where we try to put things in frameworks, we try to categorize, we try to control things, which sometimes leads to the dilution of value of true systems thinking. Sometimes solutions override real problems sometimes. So there are examples of where we try to oversimplify things. And I think there's, in some respects, a lack of critical sense making in terms of the narrative, the languages, the positions taken, and really understand the messes, that the real messes and the complexities. And we can see examples of this around COVID and lots of other issues, where sometimes we haven't really understood the mess we're in, and using different methods, but also sometimes a limited tool set. And I think this goes back to the point that Tony made, and others.
What's up?
Go on, sorry, carry on.
Well, I've got a few questions.
Mhm.
Hello?
Keep going, Gareth.
Oh, sorry. And I think when I got some of my comments may be brash and harsh, but it's just just positioning really. But when we recognise it, oh, hello. Okay. If you want to ask a question, put it in chat because I can't hear you at the moment. So limited tool set, what I mean by that is that we recognise, hopefully recognise that systems thinking is a sort of meta discipline that covers a multitude of sins, a multitude of areas, multitude of methods. But there's a lot of people out there that are using one tool, one technique approach. And that's not just at the systems thinking level, but it's at multiple levels. There are a lot of professional disciplines that use models. It could be design, it could be development, it could be systems thinking. There's a lot of one tool mindsets but with limited contextual understanding about, and also sometimes multi-method approaches are rarely practiced. Concepts and also the fundamentals of concepts, principles, and we mentioned earlier on at the start about the laws, some of the laws of systems thinking. Now, that's certainly not to say that you must understand all of these to be able to be successfully operate or to use systems thinking as a, I suppose, as a critical tool. But it certainly doesn't help if you don't have a greater appreciation that actually context is king to some degree. So it's always good to have that multiple understanding, multiple tool set around what there is in that systems thinking approach to tools, techniques, and methodologies. Any thoughts, feelings, reflections, challenges around just these three positions that I've taken at the moment? Nope. I hear silence is cool. But obviously, if we look at the present, really, so we've looked at the past, and we're in unprecedented times of extraordinary complexity. The unknown, the unseen series of black swan events. So whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's the pandemic to do with the coronavirus, whether it was Brexit minus Brexit plus, the next thing, we're hit with all of these black swan events that ultimately sideline us, and we're quite often not often prepared enough to deal with them, or we don't understand the real complexity to what it is, or how we make sense of what's just happened. But ultimately, I think certainly if we look at how COVID has tested the fabric of our society, it's impacted us at multiple levels, not just at individual level, society, family, businesses, cultures, multiple countries with multiple cultures. So it has hit us for six. So I think there's some of the things that for me, I'm really curious about, particularly around how we deal with things. What does complexity mean to us? How does it show itself in our own lives or the lives of others? But I suppose the next question I've got is, how do we deal with the black swan? Has anyone not heard of the term black swan, or are we all relatively comfortable with that? Or how do we deal with it? And it's open to anyone on the floor really to how do we deal with some of these black swan events through the lens of systems thinking or theory of practice? Anyone want to?
The one comment I make is I came across a new term called the black elephant.
Black elephant.
It's the elephant that's in the room, which no one wants to talk about. And then suddenly, when its smell and its visibility becomes apparent, they treat it like a black swan.
There you go.
Interesting. My perception of them, Gareth, is that when they happen, there is a search for blame rather than learning.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I have the experience of being the person in the project organization I'm working in the moment of jumping on the elephant and riding it into the room and riding it around the board boardroom table because nobody else understands what's going on.
Absolutely, yeah,
I think in lots of these cases, Gareth, you know, I remember just after the last financial crash, doing a session in London, a bunch of bankers there, and they said, "Oh, it's unprecedented," and you know, could not have been foreseen. And not only was it, you know, not unprecedented, like there've been 126 banking crises, so you know, get a grip. It was actually foreseen. It was foreseeable, and it was foreseen. So, you know. I mean, in that case, banking crises are systemic. You know, they come round not quite regular as clockwork, but near as damn it, and they're driven by the dynamics of the economic system. So, you know, another one's coming around the corner. It's just the way they are.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting point you mentioned there, Patrick, and you used the term systemic, and I think it's a really interesting point because you hear that quite often. This is a systemic problem, and you kind of think, well, actually, is it a systemic problem, or are we just using the word systemic because it makes people's ears prick up? So is it really a systemic problem? When you look at sensitive subjects like, you know, Black Lives Matter, or, you know, other societal problems, we go, it's a systemic problem. And you kind of think, well, actually, I'm not saying it's not, but the people that use this language, do they actually understand what a systemic problem is? You know, is there a difference between a societal problem and a systemic problem, or are they the same thing? Any points? You know, anything else? You know, how do we deal with them? And the boardroom's a classic example, isn't there? There's that whole thing of, you know, the three monkeys, isn't there? We got a big problem to deal with. Let's talk around the boardroom. We don't really get to we see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, isn't it? So
I think there's a case of people thinking systematically, and when systematic systems don't work, they say it's a systemic failure.
That juggle between systematic and system, yeah. And we expand on that, please, if you don't mind.
Most organisations I deal with are those who are in an industry where they're forced into the route of following ISO standards, so 9001, 45001, etc., and they're bullied into systematic management systems to meet the standards to get a certificate to put on the wall behind the boardroom, and they exclude and are ignorant of any systemic thinking.
Yeah, so they take very much a linear approach to rather than having a systemic appreciation.
And I class people as three types. There's those who are point thinkers, those who are linear thinkers, and those who are three-dimensional thinkers.
Really good.
The other thing I think as well is that quite often people think in boxes. They think they think it's in an organization or to do with, you know, sort of something, and they even label systems as being in the boxes. And actually, I think one of the powers in this, especially when you're dealing with, you know, things like safety, environment, society, is you just got to be able to think out in and out of your own layer. So we've always talked about in when you're using viable systems, you look at the system, you're like the S where you are, but you should be looking at the S above you and the S is below you, to understand how the whole thing interconnects. So the interconnection is not just horizontal, it's vertical as well, kind of in a sort of recursive structure. If you do that, then you're beginning to think systemically, but most people still think in their box, in their own organization, in their own institution sometimes, but without actually realizing that it's the connections that make it.
Exactly that. And I'm dealing in this project where people are forced into silos, into their boxes, and every attempt that people make to try to make the interconnections, the interactions, communication channels, they're just beaten back into their silo. Yeah.
And there's great experiences, absolutely. And I think there's a couple of things for me. There's that whole thing what you mentioned around Tony about the in the box, and that's, you know, people are very comfortable with operating within their box, aren't they? Because it's within their safe zone and they don't want to sort of venture outside. And I've experienced on multiple occasions where people talk about silo working, silo thinking, silo behaviors, and then you kind of think, well, actually, how do people coordinate themselves? And obviously that hits in the sweet spot of Patrick area with VSM, and the real benefit of VSM and VSM mapping around how you coordinate areas of the business together and create more of a cohesive I suppose structure within the business. But and a lot of these black swan events, I think it's also it's an element of sometimes naivety. I think there's an element of naivety, but also I think there's also an element of if we start to uncover things, we might put ourselves in an even more world of pain, rather than sometimes it's better not lift up the rock and just leave it as it is. And I think when I mentioned earlier on about the oversimplification, sometimes we looked at some of the way that we've taken some of the decisions around how COVID's been dealt with. But one thing that has never been really considered is the behaviors. So we can almost come up with a model, a mathematical model, to say this is how we're going to overcome this situation, whether it's through system dynamics or whatever, through some mathematical algorithms and out shoots a solution. But I think one of the things that we need to consider also, and one of the things about complexity, which I'm sure everyone agrees, is about understanding the behavior of a system, and the behavior is a key part, because I think sometimes we look at things in a very linear mathematical way, rather than understanding what is the behavior in the system, what we're hearing, what we're seeing, what we're feeling, what we're witnessing from a behavioral perspective as well. I think human behavior has a huge impact of things.
I think also what you've got in organizations is a kind of almost an anti-evolution. I think maladaptive behaviors are selected for. So you've basically, I was just thinking about these black swans. You only have to read New Scientist for the last few years to know that this was totally predictable. And then also something you said about critical sense making, and maybe preempting Tony's session. I come from a background of the Frankfurt School, critical theory. And just about more generic kind of critical thinking, though you'll often find that in job descriptions, it's not valued, it is not selected for. So what you actually have is this kind of like, the organization selects for things that are maladaptive. But again, this kind of like cross-discipline. Frankfurt School, someone asked in the chat earlier about the humanities, the Frankfurt School came out of literary theory. And now New Scientist is a science mag, but then of course didn't systems thinking as such come out of biology, or parts of it as well. So it's this kind of cross-disciplinary resilience that I think is needed. But I think what could be seen as almost tragic is that a lot of these organizations are selecting for their own maladaptiveness and extinction. Yeah, absolutely. And there's also, I think, a level of naive, level of misunderstanding of what the disciplines are. So one of the things that a lot of people do, they want, how many times do you see on a job advert that we want somebody that's a systems thinker? And you're kind of thinking, well, do they actually know what they're looking for? And and how do you apply those different disciplines? And a lot of the stuff you mentioned there around, if we look at critical systems thinking, critical systems theory, and cybernetics, and some of the other stuff, and system dynamics, they all add real value to any organization, any size or complexity. But I think the challenge, and this is I suppose the premise behind the presentation, is that over the years, as we trot on, we're kind of losing the plot in some respects. We're losing some of the key principles, key laws, key methodologies of the past, and not applying them to the future. Which doesn't help with dealing with some of these black swan events. The whole thing about creating it is sense making, is what's actually going on. How do we actually do stuff?
M25 was built through was built years ago through mathematic algorithms and never took into account human behavior. Then all of a sudden you wonder why you're permanently stuck on the M25. Now they've learned from that, so things are evolved, and it just goes to show that the human behavior is a really important aspect that we always seem to forget about or put on the side, and so on.
But I go back to my hypothesis that actually most of the people who do this stuff, as you say, use mathematical algorithms. Most of those models are not systemic in their nature. So I've argued for a long time that anyone involved in traffic planning should actually understand complex adaptive systems and agent behavior before they're even allowed anywhere near anything. And that's not the case.
No, absolutely. No, completely agree. No, completely agree. Any other points before we move on around how we deal with these black swan events, other than force our government to think in a different way? No. So I suppose it's really just a reflection point, just to see if anyone has any thoughts, feelings, or objections to what's mentioned so far, or how people are feeling. We got a few people on the line that are all awesomely quiet, which is either happy they can't be bothered to challenge, or they can't get off mute. So what's actually good? Any thoughts or feelings at the moment of anything that's been covered thus far?
Have you seen the chat? It's on fire.
Chat's on fire, is it? I can't get into it.
The chat's 61
on fire,
messages.
So
and it's not all Ben either.
Is it not all Ben? I can't see it. Silos, some public. We'll pick up some of these at the end. Yeah, Roger. A concept of robust yet fragile is better to see. Book on resilience. I'll be changing my link. Yeah, I know that. I do love that, Robin. I do like the idea of black elephant jockey. Anti-fragility zoom.
Maybe something to add here is this whole thing about boxes and out of the box. So if you look how our brain works, it puts stuff into boxes, right? Concept building, model building, and so on. That's how we deal with the complexity that's thrown at us. So could it be that thinking out of boxes is actually, or out of the box is actually an illusion? It's just in another box. And if we think, cross-disciplinary, we again, to some extent, draw lines against some other things. There are some inherent laws in how many of us who are, consultants, book authors, people who help practitioners, we need to make sure that we are different from others who try to help these practitioners too. And we do that by pointing out the borders that we have to our neighbors or competitors in a stronger sense than the practitioner is actually interested in. And so, I think we have to be very, very aware and humble, maybe, to say we can't escape boxes. What we can do is have a more varied set of boxes, and to try to add some other boxes. But in the end, it's always boxes.
I think the other thing about this is that, and I put up the comment about boundaries of convenience, which is one of Ulrich's ideas, is that actually the thing is, I don't think we're ever going to stop doing that, because as you said, Bernard, that's the way we think. But actually, if you think about Ulrich's thing, the boundaries is of convenience. It is notional. It is not real. And actually, one of the things I think that causes difficulty is people reify those boundaries. They become solidified. They become immovable. And the moment you've done that, then you've built in the rigidity that Taleb talks about. Yeah. So one of the things I think inherent in our thinking is to not reify the boxes, to realize that they are merely boundaries of convenience, and not kind of own them too much, hold on to them very lightly.
Yeah.
I think also as well, I was watching, I can't remember what it was now, whether it was Bauhaus or something else, but it was about architecture, one of these BBC 4 documentaries on in the middle of the night. But this particular architect, and this is directly what Tony said earlier, he saw architectural aesthetics in terms of the wider environment. It wasn't just creating kind of consistency and elegance within the structure. It was consistency and elegance within the environment it was in. And I think in that respect, if one was to think of a structure as a box, I don't think box thinking or thinking in the box is too much of a problem, as long as one thinks of the box in its context.
Yeah, and I think boxes are very perceptional as well, aren't they? It's, you know, one box is somebody else's box is a different box. So no, completely get that. And it's, yeah, and I do like the boundaries of convenience, as you said, Tony. I think it's quite a novel a novel way of looking at it as well. And again, language, narrative, and so on is quite useful as well. But if we moving on before we get into the sort of any sort of questions, I think one of the, you know, if time was stood still, then would we do things differently? Probably would. And so I suppose, what's the excuse not to? And I know we hear this horrible notion of we haven't got time to, and I think that's just a poor excuse for can't be bothered. So I just think it's that whole, if time was stood still, then we would do things differently. So, you know, and as something to really to look at, and how we, you know, what does different look like? You know, why are we not doing things differently? If we know things are going array, why are we not, you know, stand up and shouting about it, and doing something slightly different? And I think it leads on really to the last few slides before we open up for any questions, and that is around some of the you know, some of the considerations maybe for the future. And I think there's lots of things, and it's about state of pragmatism. One element there, it's about how we create an improved platform, how we start to use systems thinking better as a useful inquiry tool, how we, you know, I suppose, use the academic rigor and pragmatic relevance, or the knowledge and know-how of systems thinking. Because in the main, I think systems thinking to many is inaccessible. Now, inaccessible, what I mean by that is it's bound in academic theory, but it's how do you then almost apply systems thinking, or almost how do you find the space to do it? Because I think a lot of organizations, you know, won't entertain it per se, because they don't like to do things they don't understand. So it's helping the opportunity to just kind of do systems thinking without we're actually labeling it. So, you know, some of the best learning that many people do is when they don't even mention learning. So it's about creating that balance between, you know, the academic rigor with, I suppose, the practical relevance of how you adopt that in the organizations, and you know, lining the past to the future. So it's about learning from the past and pulling forward to 21st century relevance. You know, some of the methods, the principles of yesteryear are still important regardless. You know, but also there may be a degree of translation that's needed to bring it into the 21st century. So a lot of stuff like VSM, as an example, some of the cybernetics stuff is still relevant, but actually it's trying to unbound it from those labels and just trying to do systems thinking stuff without actually labeling it systems thinking. So it's just trying to align the past. It's not forgetting about the past. It's about, I suppose, re-embracing it, bringing it back forward into 21st century relevance. And I think there's an element of embedding the foundations of systems thinking. So when you look at a lot of the underpinning concepts, the laws, the principles, the theorems, you know, Stafford Beer, von Forster, Ackoff, Ashby, all of those, you know, many more. And you look at some of the critical systems thinking now, it's about, you know, without these fundamentals in place, they just remain dormant in the cupboard in the past, rather than central practice and understanding today. So it's almost, and it goes back to what Russ said with some of the mapping, the various mapping exercises very rarely get taught or very look on display. You look at CIPD, for example, and lots of other organizations that sort of teach systems thinking. Where the mapping, you know, where the mapping done, the systems mapping, the, you know, and so on, and the Wardley maps, and so on. You know, I suppose missing fundamentals in the world of systems thinking. And I think the final point really is about working with and not avoiding real complexity. And what I mean by this is it's about is accepting complexity is complex, and if it could be simplified, then it wouldn't be complex. So it's about greater understanding what complexity actually means. It's about how it shows itself, how to make sense of it, and how to model it. A lot of there's a huge amount of complexity about modeling complexity, and you've seen examples, good, bad, or indifferent, where mathematic equations, algorithms, and so on is used to try and and sometimes we try to categorize it. So sometimes we look at we try to put complexity or other variants of it in 4-box grids, and we try to categorize it. Well, categorization is okay, but actually, how does it translate into the practical application of doing stuff and making sense of bits? But I think the final point really is complexity is a core feature of many organizational policy issues. But the problem is many organizations, businesses, institutions are well equipped to deal with it. They just don't understand how to deal with the complexities, the problems, and the situations. And I suppose my question is why? We're all intelligent human beings, or we should be. So why do we move on from year to year, and these complex problems manifest, but we don't actually always have the opportunity to maybe the time and the space to sit back, reflect, and say, right, what we're seeing here, what we're doing, how do we handle this, how are we going to make sense of it, what do we need to do to sort of navigate this? So I think there's some of the things that I think that are missing really where we are now in the future is about really understanding complexity, looking at some of the models. It's not a one fit all. It's about context is king. It's about what's the right model to use in the right context. But oversimplification, we can't oversimplify complexity.
Gareth?
Before we finish, what we think, what you're thinking now? Any questions, challenges, curiosity?
Yeah, I'd like to add something to the last part about complexity, because on the one hand, I don't think we need to try and understand complexity, because that won't work. It's complex.
Yes.
So I think it's key that we accept that some things are complex. And actually, strangely enough, I think that often the solution to solve complex problems can be quite simple. And what I mean by that is that if we accept that some things are complex and we do not try to solve them by analytic methods, but we just put things into motion so that the self-organization of organizations, of people, can start working. So we just then some things can be really simple if we just accept that it's not an analytic solution and that we just have to get things into motion. It's really strange. I find that in actual problems I encounter in organizations, that the things we tell our clients are actually enormously simple often. So for example, if you have 4 factories and they are not equal and you have problems with your reporting, yeah, of course, try and get these factories, these plants to do the same thing. It's a really simple solution, which doesn't mean that you can analyze what's actually happening. But if you set it into motion, things often work out pretty well. You have to keep steering, of course. You have to keep doing the stuff, but accepting complexity is I think more important than understanding complexity, because maybe that's not even possible if it's really complex.
No, I agree. And I think that's it's a really good point there. And I think that's one of the things that people struggle with, is accepting that complexity will all be here. It's never going to be gone. It's never going to be different. It just show itself in a different way. It's just accepting that complexity is part of our lives. And it always will be. I think there's an interesting question from Roger that says, COVID, is it the COVID challenge? Is it simple or complex? So again, any thoughts on that, or Roger yourself?
Gareth, I mean, I want to, sort of respond to that and also reinforce what Ed said. I mean, all the systems approaches really are around how you deal with that complexity, and quite a lot of them speak to what Ed was talking about, which is you actually have to grapple with it, but you don't have to dive into it, so there's a load of techniques for how you handle the complexity rather than wishing it away. And I think some of the 2x2 matrices for categorizing that you mentioned are about wishing it away, really. It's about, we put it in this box and we understand it. Well, you don't,
Yeah.
And it ain't like that. There's a quote from Walter Pitts, who was Warren McCulloch's mate, which is problems are all either trivial or impossible, and an impossible problem becomes trivial once it's been solved.
Yeah. No.
Yeah. And I think to Roger's point, COVID's like that. I mean, for me, it's simple. I just stay out the way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's a good point, because whether you look at it simple, complex, complicated, chaotic, whatever language you use, it's perceptional. And I think that's what's not useful when you try to categorize something, because if somebody else is simple, somebody else is complex, somebody else is, and I think that's the whole point. So you say, yes, for you, it's simple, you keep out of the way, absolutely. But for others in a similar situation might find it more complex. And I think that's the risk you've got.
Absolutely. I'm not the chief medical officer.
Sorry?
I'm not the chief medical officer.
Exactly.
So my situation is different to his. I'm not Boris Johnson. It ain't simple for them,
No.
So Gareth, I might try to answer my own question,
there you
which
go,
of course
Roger.
is COVID, the virus, is incredibly simple. Yeah, it's straightforward, it's single-minded, and yet our response to it, track and trace, is inordinately complex. Yeah, and I don't know if there's something going on that there ought to be a parity of complexity when dealing with the problems, because that's certainly what the military found out. Like all the stuff in Afghanistan was big army could not defeat little terrorist, but when big army became little army, it stood a chance. So that's why a vaccine is so good, because vaccines are very simple. But I don't know whether somebody ought to invent a law of complex parity or something. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a really good point to finish off, Roger, and thanks for your time in that.
I think they did. It's called Ashby's Law, Roger.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, and for more on that,
that's another discussion.
And for more on that, Leslie, we probably have some material there for another interesting systems laws discussion at a Dev Day.
Well, yeah, and to finish off that, it goes back to Patrick and makes a really good point, and again, it goes back to my earlier element there, that a lot of these, like Ashby's laws and many others, are either misunderstood or not understood at all, and not applied in anyone's thinking in any way, shape, or form. And that goes back to understanding some of the laws, some of the principles, some of the theorems that are associated with systems thinking will hopefully make everyone's life a little bit easier when it comes to understand systems thinking and its place in helping to navigate the world of complexity. So no, thanks for your time. I do appreciate it. Hopefully it's been kind of useful. It's just a bit of a testing case for me out there, and I do appreciate everyone's time, the comments in the chat box, and thank you SCiO for giving me this opportunity just to gob off. So I couldn't think of any other politically correct way, so I just thought I'd go back to my military days and just say as it is. So thank you for your time. I do appreciate it.